All right, so continuing on in the fourth section, and this week we are turning to psychotropic medication, DSM, mental health disorders, and a few other items that we'll be touching on here. So this is for us, for society in general, and for believers in particular, an area that we need to think through carefully. Because if you go back to, where did psychology, where did psychotherapy start? You can go back to the 1870s when the idea of psychology as a systematic discipline was initially started, and then you can trace through Freudianism. You can look through behavioral psychology with its proponents, the cognitive behavioral therapy, the third force psychology with humanistic psychology. You can see how all those have woven into where we're at today once you start examining the threads of thought, because ideas never really die. They just morph and they merge with other ideas. And one of the areas where we're able to see that is in how society as a whole approaches things like therapy and mental illness, psychotropic medication today. And so we're going to go through this in a way that hopefully is helpful, provide some clarification, may spark some questions. As there's questions, please bring them up. As I mentioned before, and we'll keep mentioning, this is in a revisionary stage, and so it's persistently a work in progress. We're going to talk about mental health / mental illness, mental disorders. What are those? Are they a legitimate category? Are they describing something? How should we think about those? Psychotropic medication. Again, on both sides of the aisle, you're going to get a lot of heat and very little light when talking about this. So hopefully some clarifications there. Problems with the secular model of people's problems and the treatment of them. So that's in a nutshell what we're going to be talking about here. So central concept: because the world has rejected the Savior and his interpretation of life, the world must find a surrogate Savior and interpreter of life. This has occurred in the modern era through concepts such as mental health disorders, psychotropic medication, and the usage of it. And so as we're seeking to counsel biblically, we have to understand these issues so that our counsel is consistent with Scripture. All right, so page 449. The question of psychotropic medication, mental illness, and the way the believer should interact with that is one that has been challenged or challenging since basically its inception. Psychotropic medication, we could go back to the 1960s, which is really when the rise in psychotropic medication took place. Prior to that, you had a combination of secular counseling. So think psychoanalysis, which was used. When that became evident that that wasn't working very effectively, because effectively all you're doing is laying there on a couch making free association and doing this often for years until the money runs out, the shift began to, well, maybe behaviorism, maybe there's something going on biologically. And with that, then you had the rise in treatments like electroshock therapy, and relevant to our discussion here, lobotomies were used in order to provide quote unquote help for people who are struggling with mental illnesses. Yes. No.
Psychotropic medication. Can you be more, define that better for me?
Okay, psychotropic medication that is designed to impact the functioning of the mind, of the brain. And that's going to include different classes, like you have the SSRIs, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which is the foundation of virtually all antidepressants.
talking legal drugs and illegal.
the-
Psychotropic doesn't just mean like med.
This is going to be legal medications that are prescribed by a psychiatrist, by a medical doctor. Frequently highly controlled medications, you're not going to be buying them over the counter, but ones that are used in the context that we're talking here legally. So with the use of lobotomies, things like that, there's very obviously side effects. When you're in effect destroying the frontal lobe of the brain, you have a person who becomes more compliant, but the flip side is their brain is in part completely destroyed. And so in the 1960s, they have the rise in psychotropic medications, which began with medications like Thorazine, which essentially was the chemical equivalent of a lobotomy, slowed down mental activity so that people who were violent, out of control, et cetera, were then manageable. And so when you have things like insane asylums, things like that, they would be put on medication like that. So if you have the mental concept of like the insane asylum where people are kind of walking around like this all the time, that is a function of those types of medications. As it developed, they were able to negate some of the side effects, but as we're going to see here as we look through, that still hasn't been completely negated. So now we're at a place where mental illness as a construct is firmly embedded in our society. The use of medication is just like hand in glove with that. And so we see that literally everywhere you go. And in 2020, for instance, when you had everybody in the lockdown, there was a skyrocketing epidemic of depression and suicide, and there was a corresponding skyrocketing use of diagnoses and medication, mental illness. This is an area where we want to think biblically. This is incredibly relevant to where we're at today. So we want to test everything and hold fast to what is good. Every idea, including the ideas that I present here, you want to take back and hold against Scripture and say, does this cohere with Christ? And in all things, we want to remember that our ultimate goal is not a reduction of symptoms. Our biggest problem is not the fact that we have symptoms. The biggest problem we always have is the problem of our relationship with the Lord. So we're seeking conformity to Christ's likeness. So second paragraph, wrestling with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. So that's the first question is, what in the world are we talking about when we're talking about mental health? So we're going to start with a little bit of background to the DSM so that you have at least some familiarity with that. So my copy of the DSM-5 text revised. So this is it. You can see it is a light afternoon read. You could breeze through it in probably about 8 years. You could probably kill somebody with that if you drop it from a high enough height, like 2 feet. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual wrestles with the question of what is normal and what is abnormal. And so this was the systematic attempt to take abnormal behavior and describe it and define it in such a way that we could categorize it and then ideally treat it and resolve it. First question we have to wrestle with then is, how then do we define normal? When we go to Scripture, we define normal by looking at what did God intend to be normal. Where do we see that? We see that in the Genesis account in Genesis 1 and 2. That is what God designed as normal. We can look at the life of Jesus, the only one who has not been morally affected by sin, and we can say Jesus is normal. Jesus is the paradigm of what it means to be normal. What does that mean? It means in a theological sense, none of us are normal. We are all abnormal because we have been impacted by sin. If you move away from the theology and you move into a atheistic framework, which is functionally what we're talking about here, you have to find another definition of normal. And so what do? And so what the American Psychiatric Association has done is go through and say, how can we categorize what we think normal is and what we think abnormal is? This initially began in 1952. In 1952, we have a number of problems arising from the World War II vets that have come back. You have what is now recognized as PTSD in several of them. You have the traumatic things that they have seen that are now impacting their interactions with others, their sleeping, their health, things like that. And so in 1952, we have the DSM first edition that's published in an attempt to codify and categorize abnormal behavior. The major emphasis here is this is moving from a somatic or a body-based problem set into the psychological and the psychoanalytic emphasis. So Freud, in the first couple iterations of the DSM, was a major player. How to use psychoanalysis to help somebody. You have the revisions that has gone through since then, along with a very, very brief explanation of what some of the changes were. So DSM-2, 1968, expanded the numbers of diseases, and there was still the psychoanalytic emphasis. DSM-2, by the way, is a significant one because initially with the DSM-2, homosexuality was listed as a mental health disorder. In 1973, in December, that was dropped. Anybody know why it was dropped?
Homosexual lobby.
Yes. You remember what happened with that?
I think there's some big meeting they had.
Mm-hmm.
They did a major protest.
Yeah. Was it? So it was at the annual American Psychiatric Association meeting, 1970, 1971. In both of those, you have the homosexual lobby that came over and took over the stage and would not leave and said, we are not mental health disorders. We will not leave until you drop the diagnosis of homosexuality from the DSM. 1973, you then have the American Psychiatric Association Board of Trustees that came together and said, all right, we are going to drop homosexuality as a disorder. We're going to keep ego-dystonic homosexuality as an option, so basically for someone who's homosexual who doesn't want to be homosexual. But we're going to drop this. And when they drop this, remember, this is the 1970s, so there's still a fair amount of pushback from people saying, no, homosexuality is abnormal. And so the Board of Trustees pushed out a survey and said to psychiatrists broadly who were with the APA, how many of you agree/disagree with the Board of Trustees' decision? 58% came back and said, we agree. And that was effectively the nail in the coffin for homosexuality as a mental health disorder. So that's DSM-2. DSM-3 in 1980 was a major overhaul effort to the DSM mental health disorder. So there we have the effort to systematize diagnostic criteria, diagnostic assessment. They're still not looking at the cause, or they're not in this, whereas the DSM-1, DSM-2 tried to deal a little bit with cause, DSM-3 moved away from that. And you see that reflected even today in the DSM-5. They don't talk about cause at all. Instead, they talk about what's going on, and then they leave the cause to other discussionary means. DSM-3 moves away from Freud. If you're familiar, Jerry, I know this would be familiar to you, the 5 axes of mental health diagnostic criteria. So you have 5 axes that people were described along. to say, you know, what is their primary issue? What is their secondary issue? What is their global assessment and functioning? Things like that. DSM-4 text revised in 1987. They revised several inconsistencies and finally dropped ego dystonic homosexuality entirely from the DSM. DSM-4, 1994. They sought to take the terms that were used in the DSM and make them compatible with the international, the World Health Organization International Characterization of Diseases, or categories of disease. DSM-4-TR in 2000 revised the text match psychiatric database changes. DSM-5 dramatically expanded the categories of mental health disorders. DSM-5-TR, that's what this is, updated the manual to include issues of culture, and gender, and sexuality. And if you read through the introduction, you're going to see there's a heavy emphasis on critical theory in how they approach it. Things like culture, oppressed people groups, things like that. There's a political slant that is unmistakable there. You have 3 sections. You have the first section which deals with the introduction, DSM-5 basics. The meat of the book is the diagnostic criterion code. So you have 22 categories of mental health disorders that include things like neurodevelopmental disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar, depressive anxiety, OCD, trauma, dissociative disorders, somatic symptoms, feeding and eating disorders, elimination disorders, sleep-wake disorders, sexual dysfunctions, gender dysphoria, disruptive impulse control and conduct disorders. This one's fun. Substance-related and addictive disorders, neurocognitive disorders, personality disorder, paraphilic disorders, other mental disorders and additional codes, medication-induced movement disorders and other adverse effects of medication, and other conditions that may be a focus of clinical attention. Very fun. That's what they have laid out as the categories for you to go through and say, this person is struggling in this area. What category should they be pigeonholed as? And then the last part, the statistical part of it, is emerging measures and models. What are areas basically that we should keep an eye on and potentially be concerned about in the future? And there you have things like gambling addiction, caffeine addiction. Sorry, all. Caffeine may become a mental health disorder in the future, but if that's the case, sorry. You can apply for disability, I suppose. When we talk about that, we have to expose the underpinnings and think about what are the foundational assumptions that are going into this book. So the first question we need to consider is then, what is mental health? And here's where we run up against our first problem. We talked about how do we determine normal, but when we talk about mental health, there's a little bit of a definitional problem, because what is mental? Mental has to do with the mind. So you have the mind and how it operates. Now, is the mind material or immaterial? Yeah, you cannot slice your body open, dig around and say, here's the mind. You can dig around and say, here's the brain, but you can't do that with the mind. Because
the brain produces, but the brain is like the foundation for the mind.
the brain is the organ that intermediates between the heart, the inner being, the inner man, biblically, and the outside world. So where does a thought come from? If you talk to a doctor or a psychiatrist who is not a believer, they're going to say the thought comes from the brain. It is the result of a series of chemical reactions. That's what the mind, as best as we understand, is. So that's a secular definition. A Christian definition would be the mind is the expression of the inner man, the heart, what a person is on the inside, the expression of the soul as it mediates through the body. And so the brain, somehow in a way that we do not understand, takes the inner man interacts with the outer man through the brain. And so then if the inner man desires, I want to, for instance, express anger, And that interacts with the brain. The brain then starts doing things like your heart rate goes up, your breathing increases, your body temperature, you start feeling hotter, you start sweating, you start yelling. That is the outer man, but that's the inner man expressing through the brain into the outer man. So you have the mind, which is immaterial. You have the brain, which is material. Now, here's the question to wrestle with. Which of those can be sick or healthy?
The brain could be sick or.
Yeah, you can have a tumor. You can have a viral infection. I mean, think about it. This is not just the brain. You can have a liver infection. You can have bone cancer. You can have a stroke. You can have issues like this that deal with the physical material body. But when we talk about the mind, we are talking about a process of thinking. Now, can a process of thinking be sick or healthy?
It can be so.
It could be sinful or unsinful.
Okay, yeah, let's think about it like this. If somebody has a math problem and they do that math problem incorrectly, they completely muff it up. And you look at it and you go, that's nowhere near the right answer. Was their thinking sick? Do they have like a psychological math sickness? Yeah. Yeah, they processed incorrectly. So it's not a matter of healthy or sick. It's a matter of correct or incorrect. Their thinking was incorrect, and there could be a number of reasons for that. They didn't learn the math. They didn't study last night. They stayed up late and they were tired. But it's a question of correct versus incorrect. It's not a question of sick versus healthy. And so when we run up against mental health, we come up against a problem because technically speaking, there's no such thing as mental health. There's just, is the mental process correct, grounded in reality, or is it incorrect, not grounded in reality? Mm-hmm.
So if somebody is like exhibiting hallucinations, or they're walking around talking to people who aren't there, like what we call schizophrenia or bipolar, are you saying that there's nothing wrong with their brain? It's because they're thinking wrong?
So when you're talking about something, and this is actually reflected in a couple parts of the DSM. First, is there an interplay between the outer and the inner man? Yes, there is. So can there be a problem functionally with the brain, i.e. a tumor, hypothyroidism, side effects from medication that are impacting how the brain operates? Yes, you can.
Like chemical imbalance in your brain or something.
We're going to talk about chemical imbalances here in just a little bit, but can there be things that impact the functioning of the brain? Yes. Will that then impact how the mind works? Yes. However, is the mind sick? No, it's the brain that has a problem in that case. And the brain needs to be treated. The tumor needs to be taken out. The blood sugar needs to come up, whatever the case may be. So the brain can impact the mind. But when we're talking about it, so let's put it this way. If someone is walking around muttering to themselves and they're having vivid hallucinations, and you do a brain scan and you find out the myelin sheath in their brain cells is degraded, and so the brain signals are being communicated not in a systematic order, they're breaking down. Does that person have a mental issue, or do they have a physical brain issue? They have a brain issue that is then manifesting itself in how they think and how they talk and things like that. See, this is the funny thing about psychiatry, okay? psychiatry as a discipline, there's some overlap in what they functionally take care of, but psychiatry as a discipline focuses and examines things that do not have a determined cause. As soon as there's a determined cause, immediately that falls under a different domain. So if you're looking at a person and you're going, this person is acting weird, send them to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist looks at them, does tests that we're going to look at here in just a minute, and says, yeah, he's definitely acting weird. And then they find out, oh, there's a brain tumor. Okay, is that brain tumor the domain of the psychiatrist? No, it immediately moves over to an oncologist or a neurologist, someone who specializes in that area. So as soon as you have, here's an organic physical cause for what's going on, technically goes outside the field of psychiatry.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Mhm. Yeah.
A lot of people don't understand the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist.
Mhm.
Psychiatrist is trained in medicine.
Yeah, a psychiatrist can give medication, whereas a psychologist cannot.
We have psychologists running around all over the place with the master's degree.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not really psychologists because I think if things are still the same as when I was around doing this sort of stuff, they were called psychological associates.
Mm-hmm.
But most of them call themselves psychologists. They have to work under the authority of a doctorate degree psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
But they are authorized, this is a caution, they can give DSM-5 diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
So you got thousands of people with master's degree in psychology doing this very sensitive action of diagnosing people something that they're likely to be stuck with the rest of their life.
Uh-huh.
And
yeah, and we're gonna look into how does that label, like, how is that vetted? What tests are given in order to say you are whatever the label may be?
I had 4 different diagnoses and medications, 4 different 20-minute conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what tests did they run on you? What brain scans did they give you? Blood tests?
They did later that I walked out of their scripts, whatever, and
Yeah. And then, by the way, once you start taking those medications, oftentimes they have to keep monitoring blood because the toxicity levels from things like lithium can cause problems. Okay, so from the DSM, and that's going to tie into some of the things we talk here later. From the DSM, what is the definition of a mental disorder? Page 14. Mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by a clinically significant disturbance in individual's cognition, emotion, regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. Ugh. So a mouthful. Mental disorders are usually associated with significant distress and disability in social, occupational, or other important activities. Listen to this. An expectable or culturally approved response to a common stressor or loss, such as the death of a loved one, is not a mental disorder. Okay, look at that. Do you see a problem with that? If you have cancer, but everybody expects you to have cancer and it's normal for the culture to have cancer because everybody smokes, then you don't have a physical disorder. Like, what would you think of a doctor who said that? But here you have, from the premier Bible of psychiatry, them saying, if you have a response in this culture here, that could be just totally fine. And if you have that response in this culture over here, that's a mental health disorder. or if you expect it. I am really sad. I've been sad for a while now. Okay. Why are you sad? I don't know. You have a mental health disorder. Why are you sad? Because my dad died. Okay, you don't have a mental health disorder. Although with the DSM-5, they took away the bereavement clause, so this is actually kind of inconsistent with what they say later, but leaving it to the definition here, socially deviant behavior and conflicts that are primarily between individual and society are not mental disorders unless the deviance or conflict arises from dysfunction in the individual. Again, there's a problem here because they're saying it may look like a mental health disorder, but just depending on the context, it may or may not. Okay, so are we talking about a legitimate mental health issue, or are we talking about behavior and whether it's appropriate or not? Because if we're talking about whether someone's thinking and their behavior is appropriate or inappropriate, that sounds a lot more like whether they're acting biblically or non-biblically. Now they think about that. Let's continue. Other voices. These are from a number of individuals, not Christians. The very idea that you can radically change the definition of something without anything in the real world changing, with no new increases in knowledge or understanding, is remarkable. Remarkable until you realize that the thing being defined does not exist. It's completely easy, effortless really, to change the definition of something that doesn't exist to suit your current purposes. In fact, there's hardly any better proof of the non-existence of a non-existing thing than that you can define it one way today, another way tomorrow, and a third way on Sunday. By the way, that has happened multiple times in the DSM. We'll look at a couple case studies here. In some cases, the DSM-4 committee deleted diagnoses that reflected outdated cultural mores and were controversial. One case, diagnostic group was sitting there discussing, I forget what the issue was, and the wife of one of the psychiatrists came up and said, so what are you doing? What are you working on? We're working on this mental health disorder. How do you define that? Here's the criteria. And she said, sweetheart, I do that. And he said, oh, well, we'll just take that one out then. That is not how you do science. You don't do it based on whether your wife is going to be happy or not with how you did it. That is not science. That is alchemy. James Murrow. I don't think any psychiatrist would look at a patient with a straight face and tell them they know what causes depression in the brain. Professor of Psychiatry and Neuroscience at the Icahn School of Medicine. From a guy who was actually on the DSM committee. I've reviewed dozens of definitions of mental disorder and written one myself in the DSM-4. Find none of them the slightest bit helpful either in determining which conditions should be considered mental disorders and which not, or in deciding who is sick and who is not. By the way, this was a major issue of contention with the DSM-5. You see how thick this thing is. They added, I think the number was 3 times the number of diagnoses in the DSM-5. And one of the major critiques that we're going to get to is that they are abnormalizing normal behavior. Like normal living is now categorized as a mental health disorder. Now, quick question, put on your thinking cap. Why would they want to do that? And change society. There's a big one. What? Get more people in the system. Why? Yeah, why? Because you make billions with a B of dollars based on people being diagnosed as mentally deficient in some way. You make billions and billions. If you say, certainly that would never happen, I would just say COVID vaccine. You see exactly what happened.
Access to social security disability
Mm-hmm.
is another,
Yeah.
which is good.
Whatever you subsidize, you will get more of. And that's what we're seeing today. So what is mental health? What are mental issues? Okay, secondly, how are mental disorders discovered? Challenge is, unlike biological issues, there's no etiology. There's no fundamental foundational problem, identified issue that permits us to test for a mental illness. Biological issues, in the majority of cases, there's defined pathology. We can look at a cell and say that is a normal cell. We can look at another cell and say that is a cancerous cell. There's a defined pathology. That is not the case in mental health disorders. There is a subset in here of things like dementia and Alzheimer's that they highlight, but even in those cases, the reason it's in the DSM instead of a neuropsychology textbook is because, frankly, it's very, very difficult sometimes to tell if it's Alzheimer's, is it dementia, is it a medication problem, is it something else entirely? But as a whole, there's no defined etiology. There's no blood test. There's no brain scan that is done. It is a sit-down questionnaire. There's no standard test available that identifies the issue. And so how do we arrive at the diagnosis itself? Like, where did this come from? Answer, it came from a DSM working group saying, basically, how many of you all think that this should be a mental health disorder? Raise your hands. Yes, the ayes have it. We're going to make this a mental health disorder. There's some resources that we can point to where you can see people who are in the DSM committee who are saying this. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is how it operates. Yeah, it is a pseudoscience in a very, very real sense.
Can you just give me more concrete taking normal?
Okay, so one of the critiques with the DSM-5 was the exclusion of the bereavement clause. So in the DSM-4, if you lost your spouse, for instance, and you were depressed, you came in exhibiting symptoms of sadness, the DSM-4, they said for 2 months after the death of a spouse, you should avoid diagnosing someone as having clinical depression. DSM-5, they did away with that. And so if you come in and you say, I'm depressed, what's going on? My spouse died yesterday. All right, you're clinically depressed. Even though, like, this is normal grieving. This is normal sorrow. And what does the person need? Like, case like that, you don't need, here's your antidepressant. What you need is, let's look at the gospel truth that can transform you and give you hope and light and peace and joy. Let's talk about that. And yet in a secular model, you don't have that option. I'll hit one or two others as we go along here. Some of them are really funny. Other voices from Carlat and Unhinged, talking about the problems of psychiatry. He's a psychiatrist himself. When asked why 5 symptoms define the threshold for depression, Dr. Robert Spitzer responded, it was just a consensus, and because 4 seemed like not enough and 6 seemed like too much. By the way, let's go back to depressive disorders, just for fun, because things like this are very fun. Specifying depressive disorders. Let's see, what's a good one? Persistent depressive disorder, premenstrual depressive disorder. Here we are. Major depressive disorder. Okay. Major depressive disorder. Here's the diagnostic criteria. You go into a psychiatrist, and this is the test that they will give. What is the diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder? 5 or more of the following symptoms have been present during the same 2-week period and represent a change from previous functioning. At least one of the symptoms is either a depressed mood or a loss of interest and pleasure. Note, do not include symptoms that are clearly attributable to another medical condition. Okay. 1, depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day, as indicated by either subjective report, feels sad, empty, or hopeless, or observation made by others. Well, that's encouraging. So my wife can say, Tim, you just seem depressed. I'm not depressed. You seem depressed. I'm going to go see a psychiatrist about you. Okay. Example, it appears tearful. Note, in children and adolescents can be irritable mood. If your child is irritable, that may be because they're depressed. Can you get a diagnosis on your child without your child ever being physically present? Yes, they can. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2, markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities most of the day, nearly every day. What does mostly and nearly mean? I don't know. Indicated by either subjective account or observation. 3, significant weight loss when not dieting or weight gain. A change of more than, for example, a change of more than 5% body weight in a month. That's just an example. Or decrease and increase in appetite nearly every day. No, in children, consider failure to make expected weight gain. Now, listen to number 4. Insomnia or hypersomnia nearly every day. Okay, I can't sleep or I sleep too much. That may be an indicator. Number 5, psychomotor agitation. I'm really active, or retardation nearly every day. I'm not doing nearly as much. Either one could be depression. You're sleeping too much and you're not active. You're depressed. You're sleeping way too much and you're hyperactive. Okay, you're depressed. You have these. Let's continue. Fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. 7, feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt. Now that's interesting. How do you determine inappropriate guilt or excessive guilt, especially in a field that does not recognize the validity of guilt at all? Guilt may be delusional nearly every day, not merely self-reproach or guilt about being sick. Diminished ability, number 8, to think or concentrate, or indecisiveness nearly every day, either by subjective account or as observed by others. 9, recurrent thoughts of death, not just fear of dying, recurrent suicidal ideation without a specific plan or suicide attempt or a specific plan for committing suicide. Okay, so you have to have 5 of those. Secondly, the symptoms have to cause clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. And third, the episode is not attributable to the physiological effects of a substance or other medical condition. Then they have a number of notes. They have some clarifying notes that there has never been a manic episode or a hypomanic episode. I'm going to resist. We could dig into that one. And then they have the coding and how you diagnose that. But that is the diagnostic criteria. Again, you say like 5. You have to have 5 of those. Why 5? Why not just 3? Why not just 1? Because the DSM working group said, how many of you think it should be 5? How many of you think it should be 4? Okay, the 5s have it. Yeah, how would you feel if your oncologist said, this is how we determine if you have cancer? You can't do that. Yet that's how it works. You could go through ADHD and you would go through every single one of the criteria and you would say, that sounds like your typical 7-year-old boy. Yeah.
Sound like really good reasons why not to go to any mental health assistance.
Well, let's continue. So with okay, here we are. So number of quotes, I'll let you read through those. One observation of note, the idea that mental health disorders are caused by chemical imbalance is no longer supported by the mainstream medical system. Actually, the mainstream medical system has moved away from this for years. It's just in popular cultural consciousness, it has continued to endure because it seems to provide an answer. Now, began in the 1960s, the pharmaceutical industry in the 1990s really pushed this because they wanted a lot of people to get on a new class of medication, the SSRIs. However, when you say, what is the supporting data behind it? There was none. There's some obvious reasons for that. You cannot take a brain sample of a person who is depressed to say, here's the chemicals that are out of balance. If you were to ask them, what chemicals are out of balance and how do they get back in balance, they can't tell you. The other problem is, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is it the depression that caused the chemical imbalance or the chemical imbalance that caused the depression? Because you can make the argument every single emotion you have is a chemical imbalance of some sort if you ascribe to this ideology. And yet there's no major study that proves the chemical imbalance theory. And in fact, in 2022, and this was a major issue when it came out, and there were a whole bunch of psychiatrists that kind of, let's keep that back. University College of London performed a major umbrella review, so a major review of a whole bunch of meta-analyses of studies of these types of issues, chemical imbalance theory, serotonin, and its role in depression, and they concluded there's no convincing evidence that depression is associated with or caused by lower serotonin concentrations or activity. Like that knocked out a major underpinning of the idea of mental health disorders being a chemical imbalance.
Respond medication. How do you explain that?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you to hold on for just a minute because we're going to get to that here, and I think that'll answer some of your questions there. So, criticisms with psychiatric classifications. You have 8 listed there. They imply that abnormal behavior is qualitatively different from normal behavior. As we've seen just by reading that one diagnosis, and we could go through literally hundreds of diagnoses and you would see the exact same thing. That's not the case. They imply that different classifications are different from each other. Here's the problem with that. It is more common to have 2 diagnoses than just one. For instance, if you're diagnosed manic depressive, you may be diagnosed, they have the comorbidities is what it's called, the other issues that will commonly go along with that. So what goes along with manic depressive? So you may have things like depression, which by the way, bipolar 2 is frankly just about indistinguishable from just plain old depression. So there's a whole bunch of overlap between them. They allow description to masquerade as explanation. What is that getting at? Okay, you go into the psychiatrist, you sit down and you say, I've just felt really sad. I've been losing weight. I haven't had any interest in doing the things that I typically do, and this and this and this. Okay, I have good news. The reason that's happening is because you're depressed, and you go, oh, you have clinical depression. Thank you. That answers my problem. What's clinical depression? Well, that just means you're sad. You don't like doing the things you usually do. You're losing weight, and you're not enjoying these aspects of your life. Oh, so that's what depression is. Yeah. Yeah, but so why do you say I have depression? Well, because you're doing these things. Well, why am I doing these things? Because you have depression. And so you have this circle that isn't grounded at any point in an empirical test. And as you heard when we were reading through it, a lot of it is just subjective reporting. So it's description masquerading as explanation. They describe what people do, not what they have. Number 5, complications from the labeling effect, the Rosenbaum experiment. Real quick, Rosenbaum said, hey, what if we have some people, normal people, that just pretend to have a mental health issue just long enough to get admitted? And then from then on, they act totally normal. Absolutely in every way. And so they did. They sent volunteers in and they said something relatively minor, typically something like, I'm hearing voices or I had a hallucination or something like that. They're admitted, put on psychotropic medication, and then they just acted totally normal. And they were in there in some cases for months. Like the kind of problem with that was, okay, here you have normal people who are acting normal, who are still being given medication and who are still being kept there for weeks and weeks and months. If you did that in a normal hospital, like my broken leg healed 6 weeks ago, and we're going to keep you in, that would be an issue. Labels become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, you have ADHD. What is ADHD? I have trouble concentrating and I like to run around and I don't like to sit still in class. Okay. You have ADHD. That is why you do that. Oh, okay. And so now whenever there's misbehavior, instead of the parents saying, you need to listen and behave, instead they're going, you have ADHD, therefore you can't listen. And then the kid, what does the kid do? Well, now I have an excuse. I don't have to listen. A side note, it was really funny dealing with some of the kids at camp. And I'm not saying this was necessarily the right way to do it, but I worked as a counselor out at camp for 3 summers. And every now and then you would get a kid who would just be totally off the wall. And it was like, dude, stop. Oh, I can't stop. I have ADHD. Do you like watching TV? Yeah. So you can sit there and watch TV. Yeah. When I can concentrate, tell you what, if you keep acting like that, you're not getting in the pool this afternoon. Understand? Oh, and then they would settle down. Again, not saying that was necessarily the right way to handle that, but if they truly had a mental health disorder, would they be able to stop when there's a threat of losing swim time? No. This is the case with oppositional and defiant disorder, ODD, which odd. You're calling your children odd. Like, okay. So yeah, ODD. You're not. What did they call ODD like 2 generations ago? BRAT. Yeah. And you would treat that not through medicine, but through an SPANK. So you have labels becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. The DSM has demonstrated itself to be susceptible to political and cultural pressures. Homosexuality, we talked about. Masochistic personality disorder. So I have that one listed there because that one's one of the funny ones. So DSM-3. We would like to figure out why women stay with abusive men. Maybe it's because they have masochistic personality disorder. And they just have this mental health disorder so that they cannot leave the man who is physically abusing them. And the women's lobby went, what are you talking about? You're blaming the woman for getting beaten when she's just trying to be, faithful to the guy. And they said, yeah, that is a problem. Okay, hear me out. We're going to take it off the woman. She shouldn't be blamed. Maybe the problem is actually the man. And the women are like, yeah, the problem's man. Maybe the man has sadistic personality disorder. Yeah, sadistic. Wait. Fast forward. Your Honor, the reason I beat my wife and she has black eyes and a broken arm is because of my mental health disorder. I have sadistic personality disorder. It's in the DSM. Rewind. No, we cannot have sadistic personality disorder. And the DSM subcommittee went, oh, yeah, I guess that is a bad idea. Okay, how about this? Instead, we'll just say that the woman has self-defeating personality disorder. And the women went, you're making it the women's problem again. So in the DSM-4, they completely dropped it. And they just didn't touch it. That is how political and cultural influences can influence things like this. And then there's a major push to abnormalize normal behavior because it gets more dollars. Another question, how's the criteria for mental disorder diagnoses derived? It's by consensus. And you have a number of quotations there. So what is really mental illness? And as we're thinking through this biblically, a mental disorder, is that describing a real thing? Well, in a sense, yes, it is. But it's misdiagnosing it. It's something that can be observed, but the world cannot explain or address. And his thinking, his feeling, there's something wrong there. And yes, there is something wrong, but the problem is not that there's a medical issue underlying it in 99% of the cases. It's that there's a problem of the soul. There's a problem with guilt. There's a problem with the kingdom of me that keeps expressing itself in ways that society goes, well, that's inappropriate. I wonder why that's inappropriate. It's probably because he has a mental health disorder. Because they have no category for God, for sin, for guilt, for repentance, for reconciliation, none of that. And so they can't address it biblically, whereas the believer can. Why is this important? Because diagnosis drives prescription. We must look to the Bible and how it analyzes the heart and find out from the Bible what is the real problem and what is our methodology for dealing with that. The thoughts and beliefs that are incorrect should be repented of and replaced with truth. So then that brings us to the last portion here, biblical counseling and psychotropic medication. Initial considerations, I'm not a doctor. I am the son of a doctor, so some of this I've run by my dad, but I'm not a doctor. This is not medical advice. This is observations, in a lot of cases drawing on what other medical doctors have said. Secondly, this is something when I'm sitting down with the counselee, I'm not going into this. No, I'm not going to tell them you should or should not change your medication. Like that is never something you should do. And in fact, when I have someone who is on medications, one of the things I will tell them is you must not change your dosage without talking to your doctor. There's a number of reasons for it. One of which is because some of the medications have extensive half-lives. Prozac, for instance, has a very long half-life. So you can drop off the medication instead of cutting it down appropriately. And you feel great for a while because now you don't have so many side effects, but then all of a sudden you physiologically crash. So don't speak on whether they should or should not be taking medication. Yes. You don't want to be sued for practicing medicine without a license. If someone is there and they're seeking counsel and they're on psychotropic medication, does that fundamentally impact my ability to provide biblical counsel? No, it doesn't. And frequently what happens is when they see biblical truth and it starts all coming together, it's like, this is so much better than what I was trying. All the ways that I was trying that didn't answer. It's like, okay, and if that includes medication, then at that point, talk to your doctor and go forward from there. Biblical counselors should be aware of how psychotropic medication may impact a person through side effects. PDR.net is a helpful resource for using that. I never denigrate a person on medication. I don't make suggestions or comments about changing their medication. You can ask the question, so you're on medication, how has that helped in solving your problems? Has that helped in solving your problems? Ask them how it's working out for them. And then remember the limits of medication. Medication can mitigate symptoms, but it cannot address the real problem. However, this is not something people want to hear. You have the consideration there. Which statement do you think receives a very aggressive response most of the time? If you question the efficacy of Scripture and its ability to help you change and grow, or if you question the efficacy of medication and its ability to help you change and grow. And most people, if you say the Bible isn't sufficient to deal with these problems, they'll go, okay. If you say the medication you're on isn't sufficient to actually transform your heart and to make you more like Christ, that's where you're going to get pushback. Right. And so that's where medication, can it mitigate symptoms? Yes, it can in some cases. And yet the underlying problem that led to the symptoms in the first place, the question is that being addressed? And that's where we need to be very, very careful in our thinking. We want to approach the person with compassion and humility. Compassion, because even if they're placing their confidence in something wrong, whether that's medication or something else, what their need is to turn to the great shepherd. And we need humility, because I'm not the one that changes anybody's heart. Challenges with the medical model. This is getting into the little bit of a last minute scramble as I was writing this out. So I'll flesh this out at some point. Where does the problem come from? Does it come from a medical diagnosis, or does it come from the heart? There are cases sometimes where it comes from the body. Alzheimer's would be a case like that. A person who is not sleeping well, that is a physiological cause for why they might be hallucinating. And yet, does that impact our ability to give biblical counsel as well? That's why one of the reasons, if someone is really struggling with, for instance, depression, and there seems to be no immediately attributable cause, go to your primary care physician and get a medical checkup. See if there's something like hypothyroidism that can have symptoms that mimic depression, or hyperthyroidism where you can have symptoms that mimic anxiety. Is there a cardiac problem? Those can provide problems as well. But once you've eliminated those, let the doctor take care of the medical, but you're dealing with what's going on in the heart's desires, demands, and worship, which is 95% of the time where the problem lies. Chemical imbalance theory, we talked about that. Psychotropic drug considerations, talked about that. Problem with psychotropic drugs is over time they can lose their effectiveness, and so they get another medication with more side effects. So you start getting into this therapeutic tail chasing, where you're just continuing to add on medications to deal with side effects from other medications. Do drugs such as antidepressants work? That depends on what you mean by work. They can mitigate symptoms. However, a lot of times the side effects can be worse than the disease. And in fact, you have a number of quotations there. A lot of the way that it works is through placebo effect. And in fact, in double-blind studies, what has periodically surfaced is that antidepressants, when matched against placebos, in some cases, placebos actually did better, because with the placebos, you don't have the side effects that you have with the actual medication, which was an interesting point. As we discussed, medication cannot ultimately solve the problem of what I am worshiping. From the other voices section on page 454, you just have a number of medical doctors and their evaluation of antidepressants, what their impact is. So that's coming from them, not from me. Summary considerations. Medication is not the primary enemy in the counseling room. Truth is truth, regardless of if they're on medication or not. Never give medical advice. Encourage them to talk to their primary care physician regarding changes in medication. Secondly, medication may be taken or not taken out of a heart motive that's pleasing to God. So you could have somebody who says, I don't want to do the hard work of repentance. I don't want to reconcile with my spouse. I don't want to give up this sin in my life that is burdening me down with guilt, and so I'll turn to medication. We would look at that and say, well, clearly there's a problem there. You could have somebody who says, I am not going to take medication because I am strong and because medication is for weaklings, and that equally would be a sinful reason to make a decision. There are some cases, especially when you're talking about things like Alzheimer's or dementia, where certain types of medication can help clarify the thinking as you're giving them biblical truth. And yet, ultimately, we go back to what is the ultimate problem?
So are you saying that Alzheimer's or mental, like dementia?
Those are brain-based,
Manifestation, they're not manifestations of physical.
no, those are an example of something that is biologically generated, where you can post-mortem, they can do cross sections of the brain, and they can see how the brain has been impacted as it's degraded over time, which obviously isn't something you can do while someone is still alive. But
I'm just thinking about like other things too that sort of dismiss like depression
Mhm.
or something. Are you saying that there's no possible effect that the body, in the body, so you can't diagnose it? I mean,
Mhm.
it's not diagnosable physically?
so there's about 90% of depression is not attributable to a specific cause, biological cause. Hold on, let me.
You could give
wait.
illustrations such as hormonal fluctuations, or
Mhm.
you're now in the hospital and paralyzed, and
Uh-huh.
so you're,
Which even in those, so if there is a hormonal issue, like say postpartum or something like that, where there is very definitely, yes, there has been a physical change that is impacting. Does that then mean that whatever that person does, you just go, well, it's okay, they're postpartum? Or are they still autonomous moral agents before God? And that say, yes, there are physical issues, and there's a physical recovery that needs to take place in that, because we have a definite physical cause behind that. And yet they are still morally responsible for God for their reactions. And it may be difficult, and it may be hard, and it may be an hourly or a minute by minute saying, I am going to cling to Christ in this moment. And yet that does not move even that depression purely into the biological realm. There's still a spiritual component, even with something like that, that needs to be addressed. And if you don't, that's where you get Andrea Yates situations where you have someone who goes, well, I'm postpartum and I'm depressed and I'm going to kill my kids. And you see these cases and you see the defense brought up, well, they couldn't help themselves because they were postpartum. It's like, no. They are moral agents before God. Yes, it may have been hard to obey, but they still had the obligation before God to obey. Most depression, though, does not fall into that category of there's a defined biological cause to this. Most of it, and we'll talk about this more when we get to the section on depression, but most of it comes from something like guilt, or from like, I'm performing, but I don't feel like God is giving me what I've been working for, or because I had my hopes and dreams set in this, and suddenly that was taken away, or they're meditating on a loss, either a future loss, I'm going to lose my health and my family, the present loss, I just lost my bank account, or a previous loss. I lost my childhood because I grew up in an abusive home or something like that. And they meditate on that loss over and over and over and over again. In that case, can psychotropic medication help? It may mask the symptoms, but like, what is actually the cause of that sorrow? Yeah, wrong thinking, wrong worship, wrong beliefs. And that's where biblical counseling addresses. God's intention for the believer is detailed in Galatians 5:22 and 23. Paul doesn't say the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, unless you have a mental health disorder. His description is to be normative for the believer, and that requires asking questions of the soul. What is going on in my soul right now? Why is medication frequently so attractive to people? First, it is very culturally accepted today. It is also what appears to be a quick fix. If you're sad, take this medication, you will no longer feel sad. And that avoids the hard work of doing, like, I am feeling guilty because I hated my parents and we just fight all the time. Yeah, working through that is hard work, but that is the ultimate answer to glorify God. What is the difference between saying I have depression and saying I feel depressed, because I'm not sure that God is in control of my life right now? Like, people may not be actively thinking this through all the way, but is it possible that people like having a label because then they have a reason for their actions that does not start with their own soul before God? Fifth, is it possible that medication works like music? I mean, think of Saul as he's there. What is Saul's problem as he's there and he's depressed and he's broody, and David comes in and starts playing for him and it makes him feel better. But is his problem that Saul had a music deficiency in his life? No. His problem is that he was in rebellion against God. So David's playing soothe him, but it didn't solve the problem. If the problem is the soul, is it possible that medication can become a surrogate savior? I'd make the argument in a lot of cases it can. And the answer that you as a biblical counselor can and must provide is not a pill, it's a person, pointing them to the person and work of Jesus Christ. And again, I'm not going to engage them except on a very general level with medication. Well, here's the limitations of medication, here's what it can and cannot do. But I'm going to point them to something that is far, far greater. That's the person of Jesus Christ. Do not be cowed into thinking psychiatry has some greater insight than you can offer. And you can think about this. Just last consideration. If you had a loved one who was severely, severely depressed, or they had some other mental health disorder, and you had the choice between getting them to talk to the premier psychiatrist in the world any time in history, or you could have them talk to Jesus Christ, who would you want them to talk to? And let's just say, for the sake of argument, Jesus is not going to do a miracle like lay hands. He's just going to talk with them. Who would you want them to meet with? Yeah, because in him is truth and life and hope. And that is the same truth and life and hope that you as a believer in Jesus Christ can offer. I've gone very long. If you have questions, and I'm sure there are a bunch of questions, feel free to hit me up afterwards. I'll try to remember to do some questions next week if you got anything percolating in the background. Father, we